The day before former President Muhammadu Buhari left office, he signed the Finance Bill 2023 into law. While there are significant issues around tax legislation, multiple taxation, enforcement, and compliance, analysts have, of course, raised several concerns when it comes to the tax burdens placed on Nigerians from the Now Finance Act 2023. This was the fourth of its kind since the reintroduction of the Annual Finance Act in 2019. The Finance Act, which has an effective date of the 1st of May 2023, amends some provisions in 11 existing statutes. The Buhari administration says that the Act's main aim is to promote macroeconomic policy reforms with additional provisions and amendments to specific laws to improve tax administration and collection. Joining me is Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader at PwC Nigeria. He's our go-to man when it comes to tax conversations. Taiwo, welcome again to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
So I think because of how there's just so much in terms of amendments and provisions and statutes that are involved, I'll get you to talk to us, starting with your key provisions and changes that were introduced with this Finance Act 2023. It's a lot, and I don't want it to sound very academic, but in terms of your expertise and the work you've been doing when we have these conversations, when we look at this Finance Act, what are the key changes, the key provisions we need to take note of?
Thank you very much, Tolu. Yes, like you said in your intro, so this piece of legislation was signed by the president on the 28th of May. That's like literally the last day before the handover to the new government. And then it was meant to commence 1st of May, an indication that this was prepared and it was waiting for the president for months, perhaps. So it was meant to commence on the 1st of May, or when signed into law. So which means best case scenario, you could say commencement is 28th of May. And that meant that before it became public notice, public knowledge, we were already in violation of the law, clearly not how to make laws. So in terms of the process, leading to the enactment of the law, a lot could have been done better than what we did. The national tax policy approved by the government of Nigeria actually requires that if you introduce new changes to the tax system, it should give a minimum of 90 days before commencement.
Wow.
So having said that, your question about what are the key changes, of course, one is, crypto tax. This government wants to tax crypto gains at 10%. Despite the central bank still not clear about whether this is even allowed or not, and given that government has no visibility of what is going on in that space, because rather than regulate the space, they've just pushed everything into the background. Education tax, which is a tax payable by companies in Nigeria to support the education sector, has been increased from 2.5% to 3% of the profits of companies before depreciation. The investment allowance that companies used to get when they buy plants and machinery, particularly for manufacturers, that incentive has been withdrawn, as well as the incentive for making investments in rural areas. Then a 0.5% import duty levy has been imposed on all imports coming from outside of Africa. Of course, because of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, you can't impose it on imports within Africa. So this is a tax now to be paid on imports from outside Africa. And then government has introduced excise tax on services, including telecommunication. A couple of reliefs. One, if you have, if you sell an asset and you make a loss, now you could claim a deduction for it. Before now, you only get taxed when you make a gain on an asset. You can't claim a deduction when you make a loss. And if you pay life insurance premium on your life and the life of your spouse, you can get a tax deduction for that. It used to be there, it was taken away, and now it's been restored. So in summary, those are the key provisions in the Finance Act 2023.
Okay, so you mentioned the cryptocurrency taxation. Now, that's coming under the capital gains tax, and it's really led to lots of conversation, not necessarily controversy. As you said, the CBN had a ban in place for crypto transactions in Nigeria. Now you have a law which seemingly recognizes them because it must be recognized to be taxed. Do we see some expectation of the CBN possibly under a new governor removing that ban and seeing more enforcement and conversation? Because we can't forget that the Securities and Exchange Commission had actually been working on a document to regulate the digital cryptocurrency and the digital space in regards to digital assets and things like that.
Yes, that's correct, Tolu. So I expect that under a new regime at the central bank, there will be a different approach completely to many things, including, cryptocurrency. You will remember that Nigeria, as a country, has launched a roadmap for blockchain adoption. And blockchain is the technology that powers cryptocurrency, but it's a lot more than just crypto. So what that means is, as a country, and also remember that the Security and Exchange Commission also has recognized crypto as an asset class that can be used to raise funding, and then they have some guidelines in that regard. It seems everybody is moving in the direction of some recognition of some sort for crypto, other than the CBN under the Emefiele regime. So what I expect to happen at the CBN is to then have a roadmap and a structure in place to regulate crypto. I think beyond making money from cryptocurrency by way of taxes, government needs to start paying a lot of attention to data and the value of data. So the information you get from that sector helps you to even protect the people investing in crypto. It helps you to get information to know the size and the possibilities. What can we do with that sector? We should even start doing things that the rest of the world can copy from us. Not running away from innovation and getting scared unnecessarily while pushing people into more danger and risk because they're now doing it in the black market.
All right, so let's go to something else we've spoken about here, and that, of course, involves the telecommunications services tax or excise rate. Of course, that's not the only one, but when this initially came up, we heard from the former Minister of Telecommunications and Digital Economy, as well as stakeholders in the telecommunications industry, about how much negative impact it would have. But now the act says that it will be left to the discretion of the president, basically, as prescribed by the president when it comes to the excise tax rate on telecommunications services. How comfortable are you with leaving this at the discretion of the president, any president?
Yes, generally, the practice in many countries is that when it comes to excise taxes as well as import duties, you want to leave that to the executive arm of government, where you have a democracy like ours, because that space is dynamic. You don't want to wait for the very elaborate process of getting things done through the National Assembly, which can be rigorous, which can be time-consuming, and you want to be able to respond quickly. So I think in principle, I don't have any issues about that being left to the president, but it has to be done within a framework. For example, don't sign new rates, keep it under your lockers, and then we're all in violation without being aware, right? So those frameworks have to be addressed. By the way, the excise tax on telecommunication has already been pronounced by the president since 2022. The issue is that the Nigerian Customs Service are supposed to collect the tax, and they're not experienced at all in administering excise on services. They're used to doing excise on tobacco, alcohol, where they could go to factories and sit down physically and look at what you were producing. I think in their head, they're trying to figure out how do you collect excise on telecommunication. So the law is already in place, but it's not being implemented. And the point that the former Minister for Communication made for digital economy is the fact that there's so many taxes in that sector, over 30 of them, and you can't just keep adding more taxes. So what government needs to do, in my view, is to repeal maybe about 30 or over 20 of those taxes that are not yielding any meaningful revenue to government, and then replace them with this one tax, which is going to be very, very material in terms of revenue to government, and also designing in a way that the most vulnerable people are protected. For example, your first 10,000 naira a month or 5,000 naira will be exempt from this tax, so that the burden falls more on the middle class and the upper class of society.
All right, and that was actually my next question in terms of a reasonable rate, a way to sort of minimize what the potential impact of this excise tax rate on the telecom community would be. And you've sort of explained it in terms of keeping it low. There are many, many people across Nigeria that don't spend upwards of 10,000 naira when it comes to telecommunications or when it comes to data or phone calls. So it's a good way to also, of course, give them a relief. So in terms of the taxes or the tax changes that have directly impacted Nigerians, which you have said earlier, we all seem to be running foul of the law as it is right now. Which other ones do you think individual taxpayers in Nigeria really need to take notice of? Or is it enough at the telecom situation? What about the value-added tax regime? Has that been impacted by any of the changes in the Finance Act?
Yeah, yes. There are other changes in the Finance Act that would affect individuals. Of course, there's the one on telecommunication we already spoke about. Crypto, I think, would affect 90% or more of those who invested in crypto are individuals, so they would also be affected. The 0.5% on imports would also affect individuals. For example, mobile phones. Most mobile phones that are sold in Nigeria are imported from outside of Africa. A lot of imports coming from China and Europe. So which means we then have to pay a little bit more because of this new tax legislation. And the excise on services, actually the law says all services. We don't even know. Government can wake up tomorrow now and say broadcasting is, I know you don't like this, my example.
No, I don't like this example.
Where you have to impose excise.
Taiwo, let's not start putting ideas out in the universe.
That's a very dangerous example, right? So, but those things would affect individuals. And then the life premium, I don't know how many people are able to even afford an insurance premium on their lives, but for those who have it, the good news is that the premiums that they pay, they can now claim a deduction for it in their tax returns. There's another one that would interest individuals. There's a requirement that if you order anything online from outside Nigeria, and they're going to deliver it to you in Nigeria, of course, right? So the law requires that you provide evidence that VAT has been paid. If not, you cannot clear those things from the port. You have to pay the VAT before they are cleared. So these are some of the changes that may be of interest to individuals.
That's an interesting one, because how do you then prove payment of VAT, which is meant to be a sort of end of the line tax? In a situation like that, before we move on, how would I prove? If I ordered from one of the giant international online retailers, Taiwo, how do I prove payment of VAT here in Nigeria?
Excellent question. So what they have said is that for many of those, global giants, they have appointed them as agents of the FRS in Nigeria, even though they are not Nigerian companies. So when they send you, imagine that you buy an iPhone, for example, from a digital platform. When they send you an invoice, if you can't see Nigerian VAT on it, it means that you can't demonstrate that the VAT has been paid, and you have to then pay it over. But if they have charged Nigerian VAT, you should be able to see it on that invoice that they have sent to you. That's the practical way in which you can prove that VAT has already been charged.
And that would be with the understanding that these companies then remit that VAT to the FIRS.
Absolutely. So which means because for global multinationals, they want to do the right thing. To be honest, there's no way the FIRS can enforce it. But if they charge, you would expect that, companies of that nature will want to do the right thing. But if you order from a very small, store online abroad where they don't care about complying with laws, when government will lose the money, even though they've charged, the VAT.
All right, so we'll see how all of that works out, particularly as it has to come through customs, whether it's the airports or the ports as it may be. So I want us to go back to the issue around corporate taxation. We've had conversations around a lack of enforcement, a lack of compliance, large amounts of evasion that happen when it comes to Nigerian corporates. Taiwo, how much does Nigeria lose when it comes to tax evasion at the corporate level? And are we seeing the Finance Act 2023 look at measures that will help to mitigate tax evasion, enforce compliance, and even make sure that we see these corporates paying their due share of taxes?
Yes. Great question. So, we're listening a lot in taxes, all taxes, corporate tax, personal income tax, consumption taxes, property taxes, customs and excise. If I want to put a number to it, Nigeria, in my view, should be collecting as of today at least 40 trillion naira from taxes. That's close to $100 billion. But we're not collecting even half of that. And where the gaps are, cut across. Personal income tax is only about 1 trillion naira the whole of Nigeria. When South Africa, which I say a lot, I reference them because it's a country in Africa and the second largest, they collect about 14 trillion. So corporate income tax, which is your main question, we collect just over 2 trillion naira, when in my estimation, we should be collecting at least 10 trillion. So you can estimate we are losing around 8 trillion naira just from corporate tax, a little bit more than that in personal income tax. Value-added tax as well, should give us close to 10 trillion. And of course, property tax is the biggest one in terms of the tax gap. I do not think we're even collecting up to 5% of what is potentially possible in terms of property taxes. And of course, for customs, people under-declare. A friend was telling me they bought a bulletproof car. This is a very expensive car, even when it's not bulletproof, and it was declared at 2 million naira for customs. Wow. So you can just imagine that what Nigeria needs to do is not to keep adding more to our taxes. You just collect the ones we already have. There are just too many taxes already that people are not complying with. Just get people to comply, and companies would change our narrative completely. And I hope this new government will do that.
All right, there's one I'm very happy about because I have done some work in the environmental sector, and it comes from the updated penalty regime in the Petroleum Profit Tax Act, and that also helps to align the penalty regime with the PIA, the Petroleum Industry Act. Taiwo, can you quickly take us through what some of these penalties are right now? It's been a long time coming, and as I said, I'm for one are very happy. We need to see some of that. But what are these major changes that we're seeing with the updated penalties?
Yes, that's a good question. So, we all know that the Petroleum Industry Act was enacted, year before last, going to 2 years now. And then it introduced a lot of things, including penalties that were significant. Now, the way the PIA was done was such that some of the companies in that sector could continue under the old law, which is the Petroleum Profit Tax Act. Now, you don't want people playing in the same sector and being exposed to different regime of penalties for committing the same offense, right? So what has been done now through the Finance Act of 2023 is to amend the provisions of the Petroleum Profit Tax Act so that the penalties are similar to the penalties under the Petroleum Industry Act. And those penalties are like 10 million naira for failing to file your returns, paying 2 million per day, for failure that persists, and so on and so forth. So these penalties are now material enough to drive the behavior that government wants. But I have to say, for me, from a strategic point of view, government should be more interested in why is it that people are violating the law in the first place. So you can take out that excuse and get people to voluntarily comply. But of course, when they don't, there's nothing wrong in trying to bring out the stick if the carrot doesn't work.
All right, Taiwo, before I let you go, we seem to always come back to this question when we have these conversations. It was former President Muhammadu Buhari who signed the Finance Act into law. The Tinubu administration is now in power in a very, very difficult economic time for Nigeria. The expectation is that he's going to take a very hard line when it comes to the issue of taxation. You've spoken about widening the net versus deepening the net, particularly for the lowest level of Nigerians. When we look at all of what has happened and transpired, even though we seem to be running afoul of the law, even though there are questions around that, is there really a fair and reasonable way for Nigeria's updated tax regime to be implemented, given how difficult things are for so many millions of Nigerians right now?
The answer is yes. I do think that there is such a very huge opportunity for Nigeria to make a leap when it comes to revenue collection, that you really don't have to impose any additional tax. But in fact, this current government can start by protecting the most vulnerable by increasing the threshold for exemption for personal income tax, for VAT registration, and then focus on those who have the ability to pay that are not paying. What that will do for you is you raise more revenue without increasing inequality. And then you make that money available to take care of everyone, and then you can have a better society. So that opportunity exists, and I do think that this current government is thinking about it. So we can raise more revenue without imposing more taxes and additional burden on those who are already compliant and the most vulnerable people in society. And there are, templates already for doing that. It's not rocket science, but I'm very optimistic and hopeful that even the National Assembly, they have said that they're going to support the president when it comes to revenue matters. So fingers crossed.
All right, so I'll go back to where we started to wrap up this conversation. President Buhari signed it into law May 28th, an effective date of May 1st. But then also you mentioned, of course, the issue around the 90 days, being able to give space for the industry and those who need to make changes to meet up. So effectively, when would you say that this law, this legislation should actually be taking effect?
Yes, thanks. So because the Buhari administration did a lot of changes at the last minute, recall that there was the fiscal policy measure of 2023 that imposed higher excise duties on manufacturers, single-use plastic, vehicles. Also, that was done last minute, end of April. And also this one now, very last day before handover. So what I think should happen is that the president, because he said it during his inaugural speech, needs to, by order, extend the commencement of these new laws. I'll say a minimum of 3 months. If you sign an order to say this will not commence until, because the provision of the law already permits the president to indicate a different commencement date by order, that will give the right signal that we're looking for, that the market so desperately needs, that Nigeria can be a sane society where things are done in an orderly manner. There are countries where they give you like 2 years in advance of changes to the tax system. We can do something close to that in Nigeria. So I'm really hopeful that this government will start, taking some right steps to right the wrongs that the last administration imposed on businesses in particular.
All right, Taiwo, we'll leave the conversation at that for now. It's always a pleasure having you. And I know as we see more developments from the Tinubu administration, we'll continue to piece them apart, take them apart, and analyze what it is. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.